Earlier, joining us from Los Angeles, political commentator Michael Reagan. Michael, we're always so appreciative of your time on America's Forum. Thanks for coming back to see us.
Thank you.
Now, Mike, as you know, President Obama has come under a lot of criticism for what seems to be a contradictory response to ISIS. He talks tough in one instance, and then he talks about it being a manageable problem. It stands in stark contrast to your dad, President Ronald Reagan, when he ordered airstrikes against Libya in response to the bombing of a Berlin nightclub. There was nothing mild or confusing or contradictory in the Reagan response. Michael, we'll listen to both these presidents and then get your comments.
We know that if we are joined by the international community, we can continue to shrink ISIL's sphere of influence, its effectiveness, its financing, its military capabilities, to the point where it is a manageable problem.
And for us to ignore, by inaction, the slaughter of American civilians and American soldiers, whether in nightclubs or airline terminals, is simply not in the American tradition. When our citizens are abused or attacked anywhere in the world on the direct orders of a hostile regime, we will respond so long as I'm in this Oval Office.
And of course, Michael, a lot of people wish there was someone like your dad now in the Oval Office. Just hearing your father speak there from back in the mid-'80s, there's no doubt as to what Ronald Reagan would do. Your take on today and yesterday?
Well, interesting enough, there's not enough people, voters out there, who were even alive to hear what Ronald Reagan said and what ultimately he did. Their reality is Barack Obama. That's the time and frame that they, in fact, have lived in. But if you listen to both speeches, if you will, or statements, if you will, from the president today and my father back in the 80s, you did not hear within my father's statement anything to do with the international community. He was the president of the United States. Barack Obama is trying to be president of I don't know what, certainly not the United States of America. And so he wants cover from the international community to be able to do what is in fact correct. Ronald Reagan wasn't looking for cover from the international community. He was sworn to uphold the laws and protect the citizens of the United States of America no matter where they lived. And that's exactly what he did. And that is the major difference between the two of them.
Michael, we also refer to your dad as the Great Communicator. And in campaign form back in 2008, and really again in 2012, people were saying President Obama is another one of these communicators. Yet last week he communicated a message that gave a lot of people pause, saying, quote, "We don't have a strategy against ISIS." How dangerous is that irresolute approach from the current commander-in-chief?
You don't win this battle with rhetoric. You win this battle with action. And there is no real action at this point. To announce he had no plan, even if he had a plan, to announce he had no plan does not help the United States of America against ISIS and terrorism throughout the globe. And if you notice, I mean, you talked about earlier this morning about the peace agreement now in the Ukraine. That's a positive for Putin, not a positive for the Ukraine. So Putin isn't paying attention to the president. Nobody's paying attention to the rhetoric coming from this presidency as Putin keeps on marching on, taking over more and more land. And I might say this, when my father left the Oval Office, and you might remember this, JD, one of the statements he made was the most proud thing about his administration was that the Soviet Union did not take over 1 inch of property during the 8 years of his presidency. Well, guess what? That's changed.
It certainly has, and continuing with that theme, albeit in a different context, the president said we have to contain ISIS, make it a manageable problem. Well, just today, our Secretary of State, John Kerry, says there is no containment policy for ISIS. This contradiction This lack of consistency, when you get right down to it, is that the biggest problem of the Obama administration?
Yeah, they need to be speaking with one voice, not three different voices or four different voices. And that voice needs to come from the top of the totem pole, not the bottom or the middle of it. And people need to know when the president speaks, you need to listen to these things. And my father, again, if you remember correctly, he didn't announce what he was going to do. He didn't try to take care of Gaddafi with rhetoric. He just, in the middle of the night, sent a couple of planes into Tripoli, took out a couple of the homes real quick, and Gaddafi stayed quiet for 20 plus years. Sometimes just an action of that nature can solve so many of your problems, but we have done none of this with ISIS. For some reason, we're fearful of going across the border into Syria because we're afraid what the UN is going to say. To hell with the UN. I don't care what they say. We shouldn't care what they say. We are there to protect American lives. And if it means going across the border of Syria into Syria to take out command and control of ISIS, then damn it, that's what we need to do.
Michael, this lack of coordination on the part of the current administration even boils down to something as seemingly simple as scheduling a briefing for members of Congress. The administration announced there was going to be such a briefing today. We had Congressman Frank Wolf on our air earlier on this program, and as our parent website, Newsmax.com, is reporting, Republicans in Congress say, wait a minute, we weren't told about this briefing. Your dad, and I heard this from a very partisan Democrat, Martin Frost of Texas, he said the Reagan administration always took great care to make sure they were communicating with members of Congress. This president is a loner more than just in his social habits and proclivities.
I mean, even to the point with Grenada, JD, that he invited the leadership of Congress to the White House for dinner as the planes were taking off going into Grenada back in the 1980s. Had them over, both Democrats and Republicans. This president refuses to work with the other side of the aisle. And I don't know why people keep on blaming the Republicans as if they're doing something terribly wrong while 340 plus bills sit at the desk of Harry Reid. You know, we don't need to be blaming the Republicans. The fact is the President of the United States and Harry Reid are keeping the Republicans behind closed doors and not allowing them to have anything in the game. They need to be in the game, and the president needs to be listening.
Well, as we look back, as we've listened over the years, whether it's President Obama in the Oval Office or some of the Hollywood stars, most recently Eric Roberts with a snarky tweet trying to blame all of this on George W. Bush. Recently, Mark Thiessen, who was one of the speechwriters for Bush 43, said his boss was right that withdrawing troops too soon from Iraq would be dangerous. In a statement, I believe back on July 12th of 2007, President Bush said, and I quote, "It would mean that we'd be risking mass killings on a horrific scale. It would mean we allow the terrorists to establish a safe haven in Iraq to replace the one they lost in Afghanistan. It would mean increasing the probability American troops would have to return at some later date to confront an enemy that is even more dangerous." Sounds like the former president was really a prophet, taking a look at what's going on today.
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. But here's my problem with this, is the fact we've reached a point in our society, I think, in what's going on in the world, where I think the former president needs to not be making statements, just through Mark Thiessen or anybody else. I think it's time for George W. Bush to quit taking the slings and arrows from the Democrats and blaming everything known to mankind on him. And I think it's time for him to hold the press conference. We always say, well, the media never covers our side. Well, they don't, because nobody's really speaking. But if the President of the United States, former president, held a press conference to say, wait a minute, I'm tired of being blamed for 2008. I'm tired of being blamed for this. I'm tired of being blamed for that. Let me tell you what really happened and who is to blame here. The media would have to listen to George W. Bush. It is that important today. And Republicans, which one of our problems is we need to get in the 21st century, the Republican Party needs to quit thinking that history, this is their statement, history will prove that we are right. Who's going to be writing the history, JD? Not us. Who's writing the history is the left and the Democrats. Have you looked at history books? 2 pages in the Second World War. What do they say about Ronald Reagan? What do they say about George W. Bush? The left is writing the history books. It's time that leaders in the Republican Party, i.e. George W. Bush, stand up and said, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. You are ruining this country. You're taking it down a road to war, and you're blaming me, and I'm tired of it. That's what George W. Bush needs to do, and he should do it today.
Michael Reagan, we thank you, the son of the great communicator, offering some advice that ought to be heeded by the 43rd President of the United States, in my humble opinion, George W. Bush. Michael, as always, we appreciate your time. Now, we heard from Michael. We want to hear from you. Is he right? Should George W. Bush re-enter the rhetorical fray? Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum.